Recent waves of violent attacks against African immigrants in South Africa, more accurately described as Afrophobia rather than xenophobia, since the rage, hatred, and aggression target specifically Black African immigrants while sparing European, Asian, and Arab foreigners, require explanation beyond superficial economic grievances. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. The tragic pattern of South Africans directing hostility toward other Africans reveals a more profound and disturbing phenomenon. The success of Western racism in creating African self-aversion so deep that Africans themselves reproduce and enforce their own dehumanization, fragmentation, and subordination. While economic frustration contributes to anti-immigrant sentiment in many countries across the world, South Africa's Afrophobia is particularly tragic and revealing because it involves Africans violently attacking fellow Africans under various pretexts, such as job competition, crime, or resource scarcity, while treating non-African immigrants, including those from nations with documented histories of African oppression, with grace and respect. This consistent selectivity exposes the issue as not primarily economic but fundamentally racial. It is an internalized consequence of centuries of Western racist conditioning, which has systematically taught Africans to perceive themselves and other Africans as inferior, incapable, criminal, and unworthy, while simultaneously portraying Europeans, despite a well-documented history of inhumanity, criminality, and atrocity against Africans, as superior, civilized, and inherently capable of leadership. Such pervasive sentiments have resulted in the scapegoating of African immigrants for the social vices and even the economic downturn confronting many South Africans. This is in stark contrast to Nelson Mandela's famous declaration during his 1994 inauguration that never, never and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another. The Rainbow Nation, the newly democratic Republic of South Africa, where the vision of the Freedom Charter seemingly began to be realized through the securing of political stability, the neutralization of conflicts, and the overall diffusion of tensions in the country, was built on the ideals of reconciliation, tolerance, Ubuntu, humanity, Betho Pele, people first, respect for human rights, inclusiveness, and equity enshrined in the 1996 Constitution. However, these ideals are not largely being upheld when it comes to the treatment of African immigrants in the country despite several efforts by successive South African governments in the post-apartheid era. The pattern is evident. Black South Africans attack Zimbabwean, Nigerian, Somali, and Congolese immigrants, fellow Africans, yet would not similarly attack European, Chinese, or Arab immigrants. This differential treatment reveals internalized racial hierarchy rather than mere economic competition. The concept of structural racism helps explain this tragic pattern. Although colonialism, apartheid, and explicit racial doctrines have formally ended, the underlying racial hierarchy of the Western global order remains structurally embedded. Racism has not disappeared. It has evolved from overt ideology into a more sophisticated and institutionalized system. Structural racism operates through institutions, economic arrangements, media narratives, cultural representations, and embedded assumptions about identity, hierarchy, and human worth. It systematically reproduces unequal treatment and racialized outcomes, even without explicit racist intent or openly racist language. These dynamics shape how groups perceive others and themselves. Africans, the group most systematically dehumanized and targeted under historical and contemporary Western racism, have internalized many of these narratives, resulting in widespread African self-aversion, distrust, fragmentation, and hostility among Africans. South Africa's Afrophobia, though more pronounced and violent, is not an isolated phenomenon happening in a vacuum. It reflects the enduring psychological and structural consequences of a global racial order that has systematically dehumanized Africans for centuries and whose effects continue to shape institutions, consciousness, and human relations today. South Africa's Afrophobia cannot be understood in isolation from the broader historical and structural context that produced it. It is the result of a long process through which anti-African racism became embedded not only in institutions and global systems, but also in consciousness itself. The hostility directed at fellow Africans today reflects the cumulative effects of centuries of racial conditioning, dehumanization, and psychological colonization. This process began with the dehumanization of Africans under slavery, colonialism, scientific racism, apartheid, and contemporary neo-colonial systems of dependency and subordination. Under slavery, Africans were reduced to property and denied humanity. Colonialism portrayed Africans as a primitive people who required European civilization and control. Scientific racism and social Darwinist ideology falsely classified Africans as evolutionarily and intellectually inferior, providing pseudoscientific justification for racial hierarchy, domination, and even genocide. Apartheid later codified this hierarchy through explicit legal structures that institutionalized black subordination, while neo-colonial arrangements preserved hierarchy, dependency, and extraction even after formal colonial rule ended. These systems oppressed materially and penetrated psychologically. Through education systems, media representations, political structures, and cultural imperialism, Africans were taught to perceive themselves through the lens of Western racism. African children were educated within systems that implicitly or explicitly associated Europe with civilization, competence, beauty, rationality, and authority, while Africanness was associated with inferiority, disorder, poverty, corruption, and incapacity. Media and cultural representations reinforce these narratives continuously, while persistent economic marginalization and political instability appear to confirm them. As these narratives became entrenched, a tragic form of internalized racism emerged. Africans came to unconsciously view themselves and fellow Africans through the very racialized framework designed to dehumanize, disparage, and subordinate them. African identity increasingly came to be associated with shame, weakness, backwardness, or limitation, while proximity to Western identity, norms, and institutions was associated with legitimacy, status, opportunity, and success. In such an environment, Africanness can often feel like a liability to escape, minimize, or distance oneself from. This internalized racial hierarchy helps explain why Africans often reproduce among themselves the same patterns of distrust, contempt, and hostility directed against them by other groups. Fellow Africans become easy targets for frustration and aggression, while Westerners and other non-African groups are treated with greater deference, trust, respect, or admiration despite the long history of anti-black racism globally. Africans unconsciously serve as gatekeepers and enforcers of systems that continue to dehumanize and oppress them because those systems have become normalized as the standard structure of reality. South Africa represents an especially intense manifestation of this broader phenomenon because apartheid institutionalized racial hierarchy in one of the most explicit and brutal forms. Between 1948 and 1994, the apartheid regime legally enforced black inferiority through racial classification laws, segregated education, economic exclusion, spatial separation, and state violence. Black South Africans were deliberately confined to underdeveloped areas, denied quality education, excluded from skilled professions, and subjected to a system designed to continuously reinforce white superiority and black subordination. Although formal apartheid ended politically, many of its structural realities remain materially and psychologically entrenched. Wealth and economic power remain highly unequal and still largely concentrated along racial lines. Spatial segregation persists through economic inequality. Educational disparities continue to reproduce unequal outcomes, while unemployment and poverty disproportionately affect the black majority. As a result, many black South Africans continue to experience severe frustration, exclusion, hopelessness, and a sense that the promises of liberation were never fully realized in material terms. Within this context, African immigrants have become convenient scapegoats. Confronting entrenched inequality, white privilege, or systemic dysfunction is politically, psychologically, and institutionally difficult. By contrast, African migrants are highly visible, vulnerable, and lack comparable social power. Internalized anti-African conditioning makes them socially acceptable targets for resentment and aggression. Thus, frustrations produced by structural inequality and historical racial systems are redirected toward fellow Africans rather than toward the broader structures and models that produce those conditions in the first place. South Africa's Afrophobia reflects something larger than immigration tensions or economic competition. It reflects the enduring psychological and structural consequences of a global racist order that has systematically dehumanized Africans for centuries and whose effects continue to shape consciousness, institutions, and human relations long after the formal end of colonialism, racial ideology, and apartheid. South Africa's Afrophobia and the broader epidemic of African self-aversion must not be understood as a natural phenomenon, cultural defect, or spontaneous social pathology. It is the tragic consequence of centuries of structural racism, psychological colonization, and systematic dehumanization under a global order built upon racial hierarchy and domination. For generations, the prevailing global system has rewarded proximity to Western identity, institutions, and norms while marginalizing, disparaging, and subordinating Africanness. Access to opportunity, legitimacy, status, and power has often been tied to conformity with Western norms and distance from African identity, while African unity, independence, and self-determination have been met with destabilization, interference, dependency, or marginalization. Within such a racist and hegemonic system, many Africans understandably came to perceive survival, advancement, and acceptance as requiring assimilation into frameworks fundamentally misaligned with African dignity and sovereignty. The result is a profound psychological and civilizational crisis in which Africans often perceive themselves and one another through an anti-African lens inherited from the very system that has dehumanized them. South Africa's Afrophobia is thus not merely about immigration or economic frustration. It is a manifestation of a structural condition, a global racial order that systematically cultivated African fragmentation, distrust, inferiority, and self-aversion. Until African humanity, dignity, and sovereignty are restored, African consciousness and conduct will continue to be shaped by frameworks that dehumanize, categorize, and subordinate Africans. If you are new here, join the family by subscribing to the channel.